He thought she was just another black woman in the crowd. In the silence of a courtroom, a racist cop slammed a decorated Navy SEAL to the ground, mocking her, cuffing her, stripping her dignity. But as the gavel froze mid-air, one question remained. Would the system protect him, or crumble when her truth was revealed? Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story that you won't want to miss. The morning air in the courthouse carried the weight of ordinary routine. Lawyers shuffled their papers, families whispered anxiously, and the faint scratch of pens echoed across the gallery. It was supposed to be a simple custody dispute hearing, nothing that should attract more than the usual quiet crowd of family, attorneys, and clerks. But beneath the dull rhythm of legal formality, something unexpected was about to fracture the silence. Dr. Maya Johnson sat quietly in the gallery, her posture straight but unassuming, her hands folded gently on her lap. At 38, she carried the calm strength of a woman who had lived through storms most in the room could not imagine. Years of service as a Navy SEAL had carved into her not only discipline, but an unshakable poise. To the casual observer, she looked like any other professional woman lending support in a courtroom. But the veterans in the room knew who she was, and they knew what she had survived. Her presence that morning was not for herself. She had come in solidarity with an old friend, a fellow veteran fighting for custody of his child. She had promised him that he would not face the intimidating machinery of the courtroom alone. For Maya, loyalty was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of honor. She had risked her life beside brothers and sisters in arms, and she was not about to let her friend feel abandoned in a battle fought not on sand or sea, but in the quiet bureaucracy of family law. Stationed near the judge's bench was Officer Ryan Keller, a man whose reputation preceded him in whispers that slipped between clerks and lawyers. Keller was a cop who had learned early that the badge could be used as a weapon in more ways than one. He carried himself with a swagger that pushed against the rules of the courtroom. More than one attorney had noticed the disdain in his tone when he spoke to black defendants or witnesses, the way his jaw tightened with quiet contempt at their very presence. His eyes had locked on Maya the moment she walked in. He did not need to know her name or her past to decide what he thought of her. To him, she was another black woman occupying space that, in his mind, did not belong to her. As the hearing began, Maya listened intently, leaning occasionally toward her friend to offer a quiet nod of reassurance. But each time she moved, she could feel Keller's stare drilling into her, cold and deliberate. It was not the watchful gaze of a professional ensuring order, but the predator's stare of a man searching for weakness. She ignored it at first. Years of training had taught her to breathe past distractions, to keep her center steady even in the face of hostility. She reminded herself she was here for her friend, not for confrontation. Still, she could feel the hostility radiating like heat from Keller's stance near the bench. Then it began. Keller leaned just close enough for Maya to hear the mutter beneath his breath. "People like you always out of place. Think you belong here, don't you?" The words slid like poison, designed not for volume but for precision, meant to sting without drawing notice. Maya did not turn her head. She kept her eyes forward, her face calm. Her years in service had given her more discipline than most men like Keller could fathom. She knew that engaging him, even with a single glare, would feed his hunger. She would not give him that satisfaction. But Keller was not the kind of man who thrived on silence. Her refusal to react became in his mind a provocation. His smirk grew sharper, his body shifted forward, and his contempt grew louder in his stance. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom, steady and measured as legal arguments moved back and forth. Maya's friend sat with shoulders tight, gripping his lawyer's sleeve as if bracing against waves of uncertainty. Maya leaned toward him, whispering reassurance that he was doing the right thing, that truth would matter. It was a whisper barely audible beyond the space between them, but Keller seized on it like a hawk diving on prey. "Disrupting proceedings," Keller barked suddenly, his voice slicing through the solemn quiet. Heads turned, startled. The judge froze mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing in confusion at the interruption. Maya blinked, stunned at the accusation. She had spoken softly, no louder than the shuffle of papers, no more disruptive than the sighs of nervous families in the gallery. Yet Keller's voice painted her as a threat to order, as if she had stood to shout across the courtroom. Before anyone could respond, Keller moved. In one sharp motion, his hand clamped around her arm, fingers digging with unnecessary force. With a yank, he pulled her to her feet, the scrape of the bench reverberating against the tile floor. Gasps erupted around the room as Keller shoved her forward, slamming her against the wooden rail with such brutality the sound echoed like a gavel striking the air. The cuffs clicked into place with mechanical precision, but his grip was not the careful hold of protocol. It was punishment, sharp and humiliating. Maya felt the bite of metal against her wrists, the sting cutting deeper because it came not from an enemy on foreign soil, but from the very system she had once sworn to defend. A murmur spread across the gallery, disbelief spilling into outrage. One woman clutched her chest in shock, another whispered fiercely to her husband, and someone's phone slipped to the floor with a clatter. The room that had moments ago been filled with legal jargon now trembled with raw disbelief. Maya's body remained steady, her breathing controlled, her posture unbroken. Even as her arm throbbed from the slam against the rail, her composure did not crack. The years of training that had once guided her through war zones now guided her through humiliation. She would not give Keller the tremor of weakness he sought. But others could not stay silent. A man in uniform, seated at the back, rose to his feet. His medals gleamed against his chest, a silent testament to service that demanded respect. His voice cut through the air, firm but restrained. "That's enough. She hasn't done a thing." All eyes turned toward him. The weight of his words carried the authority of someone who had worn the nation's uniform with pride. But Keller spun, his face flushed with arrogance. "Sit down or I'll have you next," he snarled, hand hovering near the cuffs on his belt as though eager to claim another victim. The veteran hesitated, his fists tightening at his sides. He had faced enemies across oceans, but here he was threatened by a man sworn to serve the same flag he had defended. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into his seat, but the fury in his eyes remained. The judge, caught in the chaos, opened his mouth as though to intervene, but hesitation pinned him in place. His gavel rested uselessly on the bench, his authority suspended in disbelief. He looked at Keller, at Maya, at the shocked gallery, but his words never came. It was as if the courtroom itself had been stripped of order, replaced by the unchecked violence of a single officer's will. Maya breathed slowly, her chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. She remembered the drills, the exercises, the endless commands to maintain calm under pressure. The restraint of her body became her quiet rebellion. Her silence contrasted the brutality inflicted upon her, and that contrast did not go unnoticed. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to whispers, and soon the entire room buzzed with disbelief. Some clutched their phones tighter, others whispered about recording, but no one dared move too boldly. Fear lingered, the fear that Keller's wrath would spread to them if they spoke too loudly. Maya's friend sat frozen, torn between rage and helplessness. His eyes glistened with guilt, as though her suffering was somehow his fault for asking her to be there. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, her calm expression silently telling him not to break, not to let Keller destroy both of them in this moment. It was in that moment the truth settled over the room. This was not about protocol or order. This was about power. A man with a badge, emboldened by prejudice, had decided to make a statement at the expense of a woman who carried herself with dignity. And the system, frozen in hesitation, had given him the space to act unchecked. But Maya was not broken. Her wrists burned, her shoulders ached, but her spirit remained unshaken. Her very calmness in the face of Keller's violence became an indictment more powerful than words. And as the room held its breath, The silent question rippled among them all. What happens when the one trained to defend freedom is the one placed in chains? The sound of the cuffs still echoed in the gallery when Keller leaned close, his voice low enough for Maya to hear but sharp enough that the robes nearby caught fragments. His sneer twisted across his face, every word dripping with venom. You think you're tough because you served. That uniform doesn't mean a damn thing in here. In here, you're nothing. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't give him more than that. She didn't spit back words, didn't rise to meet his taunt. She stood in silence, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed straight ahead. To anyone watching, it looked like stillness. But those who had lived through battles knew it was control, the kind forged only under the weight of relentless discipline. Keller's smirk widened as if her silence was proof of weakness. He mistook her restraint for surrender. He did not see what others in the room were beginning to notice, that her calm was a different kind of strength. The very fact that she did not lash out became a mirror to his ugliness, exposing the raw arrogance of a man who needed her to break in order to feel powerful. Gasps gave way to murmurs. A woman whispered angrily that Maya had done nothing. A man muttered that this was an abuse of authority. Fear kept their words low, but outrage charged the air. Even the stenographer's hands shook slightly as she tried to keep up with the judge's words, her eyes flickering nervously to the scene unfolding just feet away. The judge raised his gavel with a tremor of unease. "Order," he called out, his voice cracking with the strain of authority slipping from his grasp. But his command did not land with the weight it should have. The word sounded fragile, hollow against the collective disbelief filling the courtroom. Through it all, Maya's stillness was the loudest sound of all. She did not struggle against the cuffs. She did not beg or plead. She simply stood, the burn of steel digging into her wrists, her shoulders pulled back with quiet defiance. Every breath she took was a refusal to give Keller what he wanted. And Keller hated it. He tightened his grip on her arm, shoving her slightly forward as if trying to force her to stumble. But her balance held, her body shifting with the motion without giving him the stumble he craved. His sneer grew tighter, his ego unable to reconcile with her refusal to collapse under his control. Then it happened. From the back row, a man in a faded veteran's cap spoke up, his voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "That woman deserves respect. She served this country. You release her right now." The gallery erupted in murmurs of agreement. Another veteran, younger, stood and pointed directly at Keller. "You don't lay hands on her like that! She's not the one out of line here. You are." The judge slammed his gavel harder this time, his face flushed with panic. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" But the words barely cut through the outrage. The more he demanded silence, the more the voices rose. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was disbelief that such an abuse could happen in a place meant to symbolize fairness and law. Keller turned, his face bright with contempt, scanning the rows of veterans now standing in solidarity. "Sit down before I put every one of you in cuffs," he barked, his hand resting on the baton at his side. But the gallery did not sit. Men and women who had carried rifles across deserts and seas, who had buried friends under flags, stared him down with unflinching resolve. For the first time, Keller's threat did not cow them into silence. The judge's voice cracked again. "If you do not sit down, I will clear this courtroom." He tried to sound decisive, but his hesitation betrayed him. Clearing the courtroom would mean removing veterans who were only there to support a friend. It would mean admitting that Keller's violence had sparked a crisis of order. And deep down, even the judge seemed to know the balance of power was shifting in ways he could not control. Maya stood motionless through it all. She could feel the sting in her wrists growing worse, the bruises beginning to form beneath the cuffs, but she gave no outward sign. She refused to fight back physically, knowing that one sudden move would be used against her. Instead, she let her silence speak louder than Keller's rage. The veterans in the gallery noticed. Their voices did not quiet, but they softened as they watched her, recognizing that her calm wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the kind of restraint only a warrior could muster. It was the discipline of someone who had learned that the loudest fight isn't always the one made with fists. And that restraint began to unravel Keller in ways no resistance could. Whispers began to ripple through the courtroom, starting with one man leaning to his neighbor, then spreading row by row. At first it was hushed, almost uncertain, but as the words traveled, they grew stronger, louder, undeniable. "She's a SEAL." The phrase rolled across the room like a tide. Another voice added weight. "Not just any SEAL. She's decorated. She served in combat." Gasps broke out. A woman covered her mouth with her hand. A young man whispered that he had read her name once in a local article about bravery under fire. Recognition lit the eyes of several veterans who now stood taller, their outrage hardening into open defiance. The revelation hit the courtroom like a shock wave. For the gallery, the pieces fell into place. Her calm, her discipline, the quiet dignity that radiated from her even under assault. She wasn't just a supporter in the gallery. She was someone who had earned honor in places Keller could never imagine. The judge's face went pale. He looked at Maya as if seeing her for the first time, as if the weight of her identity shifted the entire meaning of what had just occurred. The bailiff glanced uneasily between her and Keller, unsure now of whose side he was meant to stand on. But Keller didn't back down. His grip tightened on her arm as he barked loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I don't care if she's the president. In here, she answers to me." The words landed heavy, but not in the way Keller intended. His arrogance, already on display, now seemed monstrous in the face of what the gallery knew. His refusal to acknowledge her service, his determination to humiliate her despite who she was, stripped away the last veil of legitimacy from his authority. Maya remained still, her calm now laced with something sharper. She met his sneer with quiet eyes, eyes that did not flinch, did not falter. The bruises on her wrists deepened with every second, the steel biting cruelly into her skin. But she let the pain pass through her without reaction. She would not break for him. The gallery, however, was breaking. The whispers rose into a wave of voices, demanding her release, demanding respect. The judge's calls for order were drowned beneath it. And in the eye of the storm stood Maya, her silence more powerful than any protest, her calm the center around which outrage burned. For the first time, Keller looked less certain. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of unease in the corners of his face. The breaking point was coming. The air in the courtroom was heavy with tension when a new voice cut through it. Calm, but commanding. "That is enough." Heads turned as Vanessa Price rose from the second row. She was known across the city as a relentless civil rights attorney, someone who did not flinch in the face of injustice, someone who carried herself with the authority of truth. In a courtroom full of whispers, her voice rang like a gavel. She stepped forward, ignoring the startled glance from the bailiff. Her gaze locked on Keller, her words precise and unwavering. "Officer Keller, justify your assault. Explain to this court under what authority you yanked a decorated Navy SEAL from her seat, slammed her against a bench, and cuffed her without cause." Keller scoffed, tightening his grip on Maya's arm as if to prove his authority. "She disrupted proceedings. That's all the justification I need." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, the calm steel of her profession glinting behind them. "No, that is not justification. That is abuse. What I witnessed, and what every single person in this gallery witnessed, was an unlawful assault. You had no probable cause, no provocation. The only thing she is guilty of is existing in a space you decided she should not occupy." The gallery buzzed with agreement. Several veterans nodded, muttering under their breath that she was right. Maya remained still, but her eyes flickered to Vanessa, a quiet acknowledgement of the ally who had just stepped into the storm. Keller smirked, dismissing Vanessa's words with a shake of his head. Lawyers always want to twist the truth. She resisted, plain and simple. But Vanessa did not back down. She took a single step closer, her presence filling the space between them. Resisted? No. She endured. There is a difference. Resisting is fighting back. Enduring is surviving your abuse. And what this courtroom just saw is a woman enduring your violence with more dignity than you have ever shown in uniform. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his gavel tapping weakly against the wood, as if trying to remind everyone he was still in control. "Counselor, this is not your case. Sit down, please. We need to move forward with the matter at hand." But Vanessa's refusal was absolute. "With respect, Your Honor, we cannot move forward while a citizen's rights are being trampled in front of us. Maya Johnson has been assaulted in your courtroom. Silence is complicity. Will you allow this to stand?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The judge froze, his lips parting but no words escaping at first. The weight of the moment pressed on him, and for a brief second, he looked like a man drowning. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, his voice uncertain, his gavel resting limply in his hand. "Let us not get distracted from the matter before us. We must proceed with the hearing." Vanessa's voice sharpened. "Distracted? A woman is bleeding at the wrists because your officer decided her presence offended him. That is not a distraction, Your Honor. That is a violation. The Constitution does not pause, so you can move your docket forward." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Phones lifted discreetly into the air, recording the exchange. What had started as quiet defiance was now a storm brewing at the edges of the courtroom. The glow of screens lit up faces as people captured the sight of Maya's restrained calm, Keller's sneer, Vanessa's relentless demand for accountability. Within minutes, the footage was out. Fingers moved quickly across screens, sending videos into group chats, onto social platforms, across networks of veterans and activists. A spark had been lit, and it leapt from phone to phone with unstoppable speed. The judge, oblivious to the spreading wave outside his walls, tried again. "We are not here to litigate Officer Keller's conduct. I will note your concern, Counselor, but we must—" Vanessa interrupted, her voice cutting through like thunder. "Note it? You cannot simply note brutality as if it were a clerical error. You watched it happen. This entire room watched it happen. Are we supposed to pretend we did not see a black woman assaulted in open court?" The gavel came down hard, but it did not silence the voices this time. The gallery erupted in outrage, veterans standing once more, their voices rising with the same conviction that had carried them through war zones. "She didn't resist," one man shouted. "We saw it. He attacked her," another woman cried. Keller grinned through it all, his arrogance feeding on the chaos. He looked at the judge as if daring him to stop him. "You heard them," he said with a smirk. "They're emotional. They don't understand the law. I followed procedure." She resisted. Vanessa's response was swift, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "No, Officer Keller, she endured, and that difference matters. She stood still while you brutalized her. She breathed through your violence instead of answering it. That is not resistance, it is strength. And strength is something you clearly cannot stomach." Her words hit the gallery like a rallying cry. Applause erupted, shouts of agreement filled the air. The judge's gavel pounded desperately, but the authority of the bench was crumbling under the truth that had been spoken aloud. By now, the courtroom was no longer just a room. It was a stage, and the nation was becoming its audience. Outside the courthouse, the first waves of outrage began to spread. A clip surfaced online under the headline, "Navy SEAL Assaulted in Courtroom." Within minutes, thousands had shared it, demanding answers, demanding justice. The comments were relentless, hashtags exploding with anger, veterans posting their own stories of harassment, communities uniting in disbelief. What had happened in seconds was already seared into the collective memory of a nation scrolling in real time. But inside, the storm was still raging. Keller leaned in close to Maya, his smirk widening, as if he still believed he held power. His words came low and sharp, meant only for her. You think all this noise will save you? When it comes down to it, I write the report, my word against yours, and we both know whose word carries weight." Maya remained silent, her breathing calm, her body still. The bruises on her wrists were darkening, swelling against the steel cuffs, but her eyes never wavered. She gave him nothing, not fear, not anger, not even the smallest reaction. It was the discipline of a soldier, the control of someone who had faced far worse and survived. Vanessa, however, refused to let his arrogance stand unchecked. She stepped forward again, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Your word. That may have worked once, Officer Keller, maybe in the shadows, maybe when no one was watching. But now? The world is watching. They see you, they see her, and no report you file, no lie you write, will erase the truth already written across every screen in this country." The gallery stirred at her words, a wave of energy shifting through the benches. Some were already showing each other the videos that had begun to circulate. Faces glowed with the light of their phones. Disbelief etched into their expressions as they realized this moment was no longer confined to four walls. It was a fire burning across the nation. Keller's smirk faltered for the first time. It was slight, just the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, but Vanessa saw it. The gallery saw it too. It was the first crack in the mask of control he wore so tightly, the first sign that his certainty was beginning to slip. The judge, overwhelmed, tried one last time to salvage control. His gavel cracked against the wood, echoing like thunder. "This is a courtroom, not a circus," he snapped. But even he sounded uncertain, his authority hollow in the face of the reality that the trial unfolding was no longer about the custody dispute. It was about power, about truth, about the lines Keller had crossed in front of too many witnesses to deny. A veteran in uniform rose slowly from his seat, his posture rigid, his voice carrying the weight of service. "We've fought for this country so people like her would never have to endure this kind of injustice, and now, in this very courtroom, you've brought shame on that promise." His words cut through the noise, solemn and steady, leaving a silence in their wake that was heavier than the judge's gavel. Vanessa seized the moment, turning on the judge with a force that could not be ignored. "Your Honor, you cannot dismiss this any longer. Every second you hesitate, every moment you try to downplay what happened, you allow abuse to masquerade as law. Maya Johnson deserves dignity. She deserves her freedom, and the law demands you uphold it." The gallery erupted once more, voices rising together now, not just in outrage but in insistence. What had been anger was now conviction, a demand that could not be silenced. The judge's gavel pounded, but the sound was drowned beneath the chorus of protest. Maya's silence remained unbroken, but her presence alone spoke louder than any protest. The steadiness of her breathing, the strength in her posture, the quiet defiance in her eyes, all of it was more powerful than words. And in that silence, in that unflinching endurance, the balance of the room shifted. For the first time, Keller looked unsettled. His arrogance had not disappeared, but it wavered, thin against the rising tide of voices, the truth recorded in every phone, the woman beside him who refused to break. The first shift had come, and there would be no turning back. By the time dawn broke the next morning, the story had already escaped the courthouse walls and spread like wildfire across the country. What began as grainy phone footage of a cop dragging a restrained woman in open court was now framed by bold headlines. "Decorated Navy SEAL assaulted in courtroom by racist police officer." For many, the headline alone was enough to ignite outrage. For others, the details only deepened the wound. Journalists began piecing together who Maya Johnson truly was. She wasn't just a woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a veteran who had spent nearly 2 decades in service to her country, with deployments across multiple war zones. Her name was listed alongside honors that commanded respect. The Silver Star, the Bronze Star, a record of valor that placed her in the rare company of those who had faced death and endured for the sake of others. Within hours, her service record was circulating online, posted by fellow veterans who refused to let her story be twisted. Screenshots of commendations appeared on social media timelines. Military colleagues came forward with memories of missions where Maya had shown courage, where she had led others out of danger, where she had risked everything for people she barely knew. The narrative shifted with breathtaking speed. She was no longer only a victim of police aggression. She was an American hero, publicly humiliated and brutalized by the very system she had sworn to protect. For every image of her standing at attention in uniform, there was now the brutal counter-image of her wrists in cuffs, her body slammed against the wooden bench of a courtroom. The contrast was too sharp, too haunting to ignore. Keller's defenders tried to push back. A few anonymous accounts repeated his claims that Maya had resisted, that she had been disruptive, that she had somehow provoked the incident. But their words were drowned beneath a tidal wave of outrage. Hashtags like "Justice for Maya" and "Seal Not Suspect" trended across platforms. Veterans groups issued statements of solidarity, demanding accountability not just for Keller, but for the entire institution that allowed such behavior to unfold unchecked. The story reached living rooms across the country as major networks picked it up. Anchors used words like shocking, disturbing, and unprecedented. They replayed the footage on loop, pausing to highlight the exact moment Keller's hand twisted Maya's arm, the exact moment her body slammed into the bench. Experts were invited on air to discuss courtroom security, racial profiling, and the dangerous imbalance of power that allowed such abuse to occur in a place that should have represented justice. By mid-morning, lawmakers began to weigh in. Some issued cautious statements about needing to review the facts. Others, more decisive, called it what it was, a disgrace. One senator tweeted, "If a decorated Navy SEAL can be assaulted in court without consequence, what hope does the average citizen have?" That line was shared tens of thousands of times in less than an hour. For Maya, still reeling from the physical and emotional impact of what had happened, the sudden rush of attention was both affirming and overwhelming. She had not sought the spotlight, but the spotlight had found her, and now her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who saw in her a reflection of injustice, of struggle, of the fight to be treated with dignity. The storm had begun, and there was no sign it would pass quietly. By noon, the courthouse steps had turned into a living wall of voices. Veterans in dress jackets stood shoulder to shoulder with parents pushing strollers. Students held handmade signs. The chant rose in steady waves. "Justice for Maya," clear enough to cut through sirens 2 blocks away. It was not a spectacle. It was a gathering of people who had watched the same short clip and drawn the same conclusion. Something sacred had been violated. News vans lined the curb, satellite dishes pointed skyward like white sails. Reporters drifted through the crowd with mics and notebooks, careful to keep cameras rolling. A retired medic from Maya's first deployment spoke softly into one microphone. He told the story of a river crossing under fire and how Maya had doubled back for a wounded private when the rope snapped. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight of the memory did the work for him. A group of women from a local military spouses association set up a folding table with water bottles and small packets of bandages. They were used to preparing for long waits. One poured water for a teenage girl who had come alone after school, backpack still slung over one shoulder. The girl said she did not know Maya, but she knew what it felt like to be told to sit down and be quiet. She wanted to stand in a place where that sentence no longer held. When Vanessa Price stepped through the revolving doors, the crowd shifted, then stilled. She had been inside with Maya's legal team, pushing for records and insisting on a statement from courthouse leadership. Cameras pivoted toward her as if drawn by the gravity of her calm. Vanessa gave no speech. She simply said that Maya was safe, that the facts mattered, and that the process would be watched by more eyes than usual. Then she turned to the veterans gathered at the front row of steps and thanked them for their steadiness. It was the only word that fit. Across the plaza, a young officer tried to move the perimeter line back a few feet. He did not bark orders, he asked. The crowd adjusted by inches, and the chant resumed at a lower volume, like a heartbeat finding rhythm after a sprint. A pastor led a short prayer. A nurse held up her phone to show a reporter the bruise blooming around Maya's wrist in the frame where the cuffs bit down. She whispered that she had seen the same pattern too many times in the emergency room, and that the bruise always told the same story. Inside the courthouse, panes of glass reflected the gathering as a wavering mural of faces and colors. Outside, the heat on the concrete rose and the air tasted like asphalt. Still, the people stayed. Some handed out small flags, others shared sandwiches cut in halves and quarters. 2 law students read aloud a list of rights in clear voices, taking turns when the wind stole a sentence. No one pushed. No one crossed the taped line. The power here was not in the noise, it was in the patience. A local anchor closed a live segment with a simple line. Today, the courthouse is the story. Behind her, the crowd lifted the chant once more, steady and even, "Justice for Maya." It did not crash like thunder. It moved like tide. The courthouse press room had never felt so small. Microphones crowded the podium, red lights blinking from every direction. The spokesperson for the court shuffled papers as though order could be found in shuffling. He tried to start with neutral phrases about procedure and ongoing review, but the words sagged before they reached the edge of the room. Reporters were not here for half-truths. They had watched the same video that millions of others had seen by now, and they wanted more than language that circled without landing. One asked if the officer had been suspended. The spokesperson hesitated, lips pressed tight. Another pressed about whether the judge on the bench had called for order or ignored the violence. A third asked why a decorated veteran could be treated with less respect than a trespasser. The questions stacked like bricks, one atop another, forming a wall he could not climb. His voice cracked when he said internal processes would take time. It sounded hollow against the rising tempo of typing fingers. In the background, emails were already circulating. Drafts of memos spoke of controlling narrative and ensuring that the incident was framed as isolated. Words like regrettable and unfortunate peppered the lines, but not accountability. In one, a senior official advised staff to emphasize decorum over detail, to say Maya had been loud, disruptive, out of turn. They gambled that if the focus stayed on rules of the court, the bruise on her wrist could be faded into shadow. But shadows shrink under the blaze of attention. A clerk leaked one of those emails to a reporter before dusk. Within hours, headlines flashed. Court officials attempt to spin assault. The word spin carried more weight than any denial could push back. Protesters outside read the article aloud into bullhorns, their voices carrying into the evening air. The chant shifted, sharper now, not just justice for Maya, but no more lies. Inside, the officials convened behind closed doors. They spoke in clipped tones about damage control. One suggested calling Maya privately with an apology. Another warned that any private apology without public admission would backfire. Silence stretched heavy across the table. At last, someone said the quiet truth aloud. "We are not afraid of her. We are afraid of what she represents." A decorated black woman with discipline, credibility, and calm, she could not be painted as reckless. She was living contradiction to every excuse. And then came her voice. Not through leaks, not through whispers, but standing firm before the cameras. Maya's first statement was brief, steady, like the measured cadence of a soldier who knew words could weigh as much as weapons. She said she had not been shouting. She said she had not resisted. She said she had endured, because she had learned long ago to control her breathing when pain tried to take control of her body. Then she paused and her eyes found the lens. "If this happens to me," she asked, "what happens to those without my training?" The silence that followed was louder than any chant outside. Reporters lowered pens for a heartbeat. Even the clicking of shutters slowed. In that quiet, the shape of the story shifted. It was no longer about one officer's aggression. It was about a system tested in public light and found wanting. Maya stepped away without another word, her posture unshaken. Outside, the crowd heard her words through phones and radios, and the chant swelled once more. Justice for Maya. This time it was not just demand, it was vow. The defense of Officer Ryan Keller began to unravel the moment evidence surfaced. He had claimed his body camera malfunctioned. Technical errors were not unusual, he said, and sometimes wires slipped loose or files corrupted. It was a thin excuse, but it might have bought him cover if not for one oversight. Another deputy's camera caught the incident from across the aisle, and that feed had no glitch. It captured every second, every motion, every word spoken under fluorescent courthouse light, and the listener engendered a love for her that lasted for an. The footage showed Maya seated quietly, leaning slightly toward her friend to whisper. Keller stepped forward aggressively, towering over her with an expression not of duty, but of disdain. The clip caught his hand, jerking her arm upward, slamming her against the bench with force that echoed in the chamber. Her face did not contort with anger, only with controlled breath. Her jaw tight against the surge of pain. Gasps rose from those nearby, but Keller barked orders as if commanding a battlefield where no one else had authority. His voice carried arrogance, not necessity. There was no threat in her posture, no reason for his violence. When the video leaked, it spread faster than any press release could chase it. News anchors replayed the moment in slow motion, analyzing his grip, his shove, the tilt of Maya's head as she steadied herself rather than lash out. Commentators spoke of power imbalance, of prejudice laid bare under the cold eye of a camera. The excuse of malfunction no longer mattered. The public had seen with their own eyes. Vanessa Price, the civil rights attorney already standing in Maya's corner, seized the opportunity. In interviews, she framed the incident not as an isolated outburst but as part of a larger pattern. She said misconduct did not happen in silence, but under the shelter of silence, when institutions chose not to see what was placed before them. And she promised that Keller's past would not remain hidden any longer. The camera did not just expose one moment, it lit a path backward, into a history written in complaints ignored and files buried. In living rooms across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. They had seen viral clips before, but this one was different. The woman held in cuffs was not just a victim of police excess. She was a Navy SEAL, a decorated veteran, a woman who had risked her life for the freedoms now denied her in a courtroom. That contradiction struck deep. It was betrayal not just of one woman, but of the promise of service and honor itself. Vanessa delivered her next blow during a press conference that felt more like a courtroom cross-examination. She held a thick folder, not of speculation but of paper trails long neglected. Keller, she revealed, had a record. The words landed with heavy weight. Not spotless service, not isolated error, a record of complaints, many written by those who had no platform until now. One report described a young black man pulled from his car without cause, later released without charge. Another detailed a Latina mother accused of resisting when she asked why she was being searched in front of her children. A third claimed verbal abuse against a female officer in his own unit, dismissed after she transferred precincts. Each case ended quietly, complaints stamped with language of insufficient evidence or witness credibility in question. Yet together, they told a story not of coincidence but of consistency. A pattern emerged like a stain spreading across fabric. Vanessa read passages aloud, her voice steady, measured. She did not embellish. She did not need to. The words of those once silenced carried their own weight. Reporters scribbled notes, some shaking their heads as though unwilling to believe such a pattern could remain hidden so long. But silence had protected him, and systems had reinforced that silence. Keller's defenders shifted tone in response. They spoke of stress, of long hours, of misunderstandings. They suggested that Maya's presence in court had been a distraction, that Keller had overreacted under pressure. Yet such excuses fell flat against the weight of documented history. Stress could not explain repeated complaints of the same kind, lodged by different people across years. Misunderstanding could not account for bruises, for fear, for the steady hum of prejudice woven into the details. Then came Karen, A civilian witness, she had attended the courthouse that day for unrelated matters. After watching the video circulate, she stepped forward to share her story. Years earlier, she said, Keller had stopped her outside a grocery store, accused her of shoplifting despite her empty hands. She had been searched against her will, humiliated in public view, and released without so much as an apology when nothing was found. She never filed a complaint, fearing it would vanish into the same void as others. But seeing Maya endure violence under the same hand rekindled her memory. She could no longer remain silent. Her confession added human face to paper records. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was lived experience, multiplied across lives touched by one officer's unchecked power. And Karen's courage to speak gave strength to others. More calls reached Vanessa's office, more stories poured in. What had been whispers became chorus. By the week's end, the story had escaped the courthouse walls entirely. It was no longer just a legal question but a national reckoning. Social media framed Keller as the face of racist policing, his smirk frozen in screenshots replayed with captions of outrage. The hashtag spread, Navy SEAL Justice. It trended not just in the United States but internationally, striking a chord with those who saw in Maya's calm defiance a universal struggle for dignity. Commentators called it a perfect storm. The victim was not anonymous, not easily discredited. Maya's record spoke louder than any denial. Her discipline in silence contrasted with his loud aggression. Her decorated service reflected sacrifice. His exposed record reflected abuse of authority. The comparison was too stark to ignore. Even those cautious to criticize police found it impossible to dismiss what unfolded so plainly before them. Protests swelled beyond courthouse steps. Veterans marched alongside civilians, their uniforms lending gravity to chants. Signs bore her name, her image, her question. If this happens to me, what happens to those without my training? It became rallying cry not just for her case, but for broader reform. News anchors spoke of institutions scrambling to preserve legitimacy. Politicians issued statements, some carefully worded, others outright condemning the assault. Talk shows debated accountability, some framing it as a matter of one bad officer, others insisting it revealed systemic rot. Everywhere the conversation grew, refusing to shrink back into silence. Keller, meanwhile, remained defiant. He spoke through his attorney, denying wrongdoing, insisting Maya resisted, claiming his actions were necessary for safety. Yet each denial clashed against video evidence, against witness testimony, against the rising tide of voices saying otherwise. His words sounded smaller with each repetition, swallowed by the roar of collective outrage. Maya, through it all, stayed composed. She made no long speeches, no angry declarations. Her silence carried more power than Keller's noise. Each time she appeared in public, bruises visible on her wrists, cameras caught her steady walk, her lifted chin. She represented not vengeance but resilience. And as the movement gained ground, the story of Ryan Keller ceased to be about one officer's misdeeds. It became symbol, cautionary tale, rallying point. His unmasking was not just personal downfall. It was exposure of the structures that had shielded him, the silence that had enabled him, the arrogance that had convinced him he would never face consequence. The hashtag continued its climb. Navy SEAL Justice was no longer just a slogan, it was demand. It was reminder that truth, once unmasked, could not be dressed again in lies. The courthouse no longer felt like a place of quiet authority. By morning, its marble steps had transformed into a stage of resistance. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with activists carrying megaphones. Students waved banners painted hastily in dorm rooms, their colors bright against the gray stone of the building. The chants rolled in waves, carried by the conviction of hundreds swelling into thousands. Honor her service, end racist police. The words echoed against glass windows and carried through city streets, drawing passers-by into the growing current of outrage. Reporters moved through the crowd, their cameras capturing the faces of men and women who had fought overseas, only to return home to a country where one of their own had been humiliated in court. Their voices trembled not from weakness, but from fury, because Maya's story struck at their pride and their sense of belonging. To harm her was to dishonor all who had worn the uniform. "We don't leave one behind," a Marine veteran told a microphone, his fists clenched as he held up a sign, "and we won't leave her behind now." The sight of those veterans lent the protests a gravity that could not be dismissed as mere noise. Activists who had long pushed for police reform found new allies in men and women with medals pinned to their chests. Students who had marched for racial justice now marched with those who had served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The unity of those groups carried a symbolic weight that shook city leadership. It was not easy to dismiss them when soldiers stood in formation on courthouse steps, chanting the same slogans as young activists in hoodies and jeans. Inside the courthouse, the noise bled through thick walls. Judges shifted uncomfortably on benches. Clerks whispered about whether proceedings could continue with such a storm outside. The institution tried to remain steady, but its rhythm was disrupted. The courthouse was no longer sealed off from the world. It was under siege not with violence, but with truth, with bodies gathered in defiance of silence. Police formed barricades, but even they looked uneasy. Some lowered their eyes when veterans approached, unwilling to lock stares with men twice their age who bore combat badges and hardened gazes. The chants continued, unbroken, steady as drums: honor her service, end racist police. It was no longer just Maya's fight, it was everyone's. When Chief Donovan arrived, the air shifted. He was not a stranger to tension, but the sight before him unsettled even his hardened demeanor. His motorcade pulled up to the side entrance, yet protesters caught sight of him. Chants swelled louder, cameras turned, microphones thrust forward. He walked briskly, his uniform pressed, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. But even polished authority could not silence the question hanging in the air: where did he stand? Inside, he moved with urgency until he found Keller waiting in a side room. The officer who once radiated arrogance now sat hunched, sweat clinging to his brow. The chief wasted no time. "Where's your footage?" His voice was sharp, stripped of ceremony. It cut through the room with the weight of accusation. Keller stammered, reaching for excuses rehearsed too many times. "It malfunctioned, Chief. Technical failure. Nothing I could do." The chief leaned forward, his tone colder. "Then why does backup footage show what yours does not? Why are we seeing you escalate against a woman sitting silently? Why is the public watching a decorated veteran slammed into a bench while your camera conveniently blinks out?" Keller faltered. His voice wavered, his body stiff with the awareness that the shield of silence was cracking. He muttered about pressure, about distractions, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. The chief's silence in response was heavier than reprimand. The confrontation did not stay behind closed doors. Word of it slipped out, carried by whispers and leaks. Soon reports circulated that the chief himself had demanded answers from Keller. The narrative shifted again. It was no longer simply about one rogue officer, but about the institution's leadership scrambling to preserve credibility. The sight of the chief arriving had already electrified protesters. The news that he had confronted Keller added fuel to the fire. Outside, chants turned sharper. Signs read, "Where's the footage?" echoing the very question posed inside. Reporters repeated it on air. Citizens asked it in conversations. The question became unavoidable. The silence of leadership could no longer protect Keller. His excuses crumbled under the weight of evidence, under the demand of voices refusing to fade. The storm outside had already rattled the courthouse walls, but the young officer's decision to step forward cracked them wide open. His name was Officer Daniels, a man not long out of the academy, barely older than the students waving signs in the streets. His hands shook as he held the small device, but his voice was steady. He admitted he had carried the weight of silence for too long. What he had witnessed, he could no longer hide. The recording played, its sound raw and unpolished, but the words were unmistakable. A superior officer's voice barked directives to a room full of recruits. Assert dominance quickly. Don't give them space to question your authority. Target the ones who look like trouble. Shut it down before it escalates. The phrase assertive targeting was repeated again and again. To leadership it had sounded clinical, even professional. To the crowd hearing it now, it was nothing but evidence of sanctioned bias. Gasps spread across the gathered protesters, followed by outrage that surged like a wave. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, their cameras pivoting to Daniels as if he were now the most important figure outside those courthouse doors. His face betrayed fear, but also relief, as though telling the truth had unburdened him at last. He looked out at the veterans, the students, the activists, and nodded slightly, as if to say he was finally standing on the right side. Vanessa seized the silence that followed, stepping forward onto the courthouse steps. She did not need a microphone. Her voice carried with the authority of someone who understood the moment could not be wasted. "Listen to what you just heard," she declared. "This is not about one man who lost his temper. This is not about one officer who crossed a line. This is about a culture that trained him to see citizens as enemies, a system that rewarded him for crushing dignity under the weight of a badge." Her words cut sharp, and the crowd roared back in agreement. She raised her hand, waiting until the noise ebbed, then continued. "If this can happen to Maya Turner, a woman who served this country in uniform, who risked her life in foreign lands, what happens to those who don't have her name, her medals, her training? What happens to those who don't have a camera catching it? How many stories never make it here? How many voices have been buried because there is no recording, no witness, no chance?" The questions hung heavy in the air. Some in the crowd wiped tears from their eyes. Others clenched their fists in renewed determination. Veterans looked at Maya, standing silently near the entrance, her gaze steady. She hadn't spoken, but her presence carried weight beyond words. She was living proof of both service and survival, and the system's failure was written across her bruises. The chants shifted, evolving in real time. Signs that had read, "Justice for Maya," now bore hastily scrawled new words. Not one man, systemic. The rhythm of the protest transformed. It was no longer just Keller's name being shouted, but the broader call to dismantle a culture that had sanctioned his behavior. Inside the courthouse, officials panicked. Emails flew back and forth, directives scrambled to frame the situation as an isolated problem. But outside, the crowd had already decided the truth. They knew now that Keller was not alone, that his arrogance had been fed by policies, by silence, by leaders who thought no one would ever challenge them. That illusion had shattered. Keller, listening from within, felt the weight of betrayal. The system he had counted on to shield him was cracking apart, its secrets spilling into the open. He clenched his fists, but the smirk that once defined him was gone. He was a man cornered, his arrogance stripped bare by a recording and by a crowd unwilling to turn away. Maya's calm figure stood as the center of it all. She did not gloat, did not lash out. Her quiet steadiness made the storm around her seem even louder. She was not just the victim anymore. She was the reason people demanded change, the symbol of dignity that refused to be erased. What began as one officer's act of violence in a courtroom had grown into a reckoning far larger than any of them had imagined. The courthouse was no longer just a building of justice. It had become the battleground for the soul of the system itself. The courthouse had never felt so suffocating. Crowds outside roared with chants that shook the windows, while inside, tension grew thick enough to choke. That was when Keller's final lifeline stormed through the doors. His husband, Richard Calloway, a high-powered attorney known for bulldozing his opponents, arrived like a man stepping into battle. His tailored suit caught the light as he moved with practiced aggression, the kind that suggested he believed the room belonged to him. His eyes locked on Vanessa Price, and he wasted no time. "This ends now," Richard barked, his voice booming through the chamber. "You are about to face the largest lawsuit of your career. Defamation, harassment, targeting a decorated officer in front of cameras. I will drag this circus into federal court and bleed you for every word. He slammed a leather folder onto the table, documents spilling out like weapons laid bare. Vanessa did not flinch. She stood firm, her dark eyes steady, her voice even but edged with steel. "Your threats don't scare me," she replied. "This is not about me. This is about the truth, about what your husband did in front of witnesses and cameras. You can try to bully, but the evidence speaks louder than your legal theater." Maya, still recovering but resolute, sat silently nearby, watching the clash. She had faced worse intimidation in combat zones. Compared to mortar fire, the lawyer's voice was only noise, yet the venom in Richard's words made it clear he would stop at nothing to protect Keller, even if it meant burning everything else to the ground. Richard leaned closer, his words dripping with arrogance. "Do you know who funds this courthouse? Do you know who I golf with on weekends? Judges, legislators, the very people who decide your future. You are stepping on a minefield you cannot cross." Vanessa's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Then let it explode, because I will not be silenced. Maya Turner deserves justice, and no backroom deal or loud lawyer is going to bury that." The crowd outside, overhearing fragments of the exchange through phones and reporters, erupted louder. Protesters began chanting Vanessa's name alongside Maya's. The people had chosen their champions, and Richard's booming threats only made Keller's side look more desperate. Keller himself sat rigid, jaw tight, fury flickering across his face. Watching his lawyer husband fail to intimidate his opponent cut at his pride deeper than any punishment so far. The legal firestorm that Richard had promised was real, but so was the public wave rising against them. Vanessa knew the battle was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had spilled into the streets, into the hearts of people who had grown tired of watching silence smother justice. If Richard's threats represented brute force, the next move came in whispers and shadows. Courthouse lawyers, nervous about the institution's crumbling reputation, sought Vanessa out privately. One in particular, a gray-haired man named Lowell, carried himself like a man drowning. He motioned for Vanessa to step aside, away from the cameras, his voice low enough to signal that this was not meant for public ears. "Let us end this quietly," he urged, sliding a folder toward her. Inside was a settlement offer, generous by any financial measure. Your client could walk away with her record intact, her career untouched, and compensation that would keep her comfortable for years. No headlines, no trials, no endless appeals. Just peace. Vanessa didn't even look at the number written inside. She pushed the folder back with a single finger, her voice calm but laced with fury. "Her dignity is not for sale. You think you can buy silence, but you forget she's not the one on trial here. The system is. And no check you write can erase what Keller did or what you allowed him to become." Maya looked at Lowell, her eyes piercing. She did not need to speak. The scars on her wrists from Keller's grip said more than money ever could. The gray-haired lawyer faltered, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. For the first time, he seemed to realize the settlement wasn't just being rejected. It was being exposed for what it was. Another attempt at erasure. Word of the hush offer spread quickly. Reporters caught wind of it, amplifying the scandal. Protesters outside added new chants. No deals, no silence. What had been meant to contain the storm only fueled it. The courthouse itself seemed to groan under the weight of growing exposure, its foundations trembling as long-hidden rot was dragged into the light. Behind closed doors, panic spread. Officials whispered about damage control, spinning the story and limiting liability. Yet the harder they tried to cover, the more the public pushed back. Vanessa had lit a fire that no backroom bargain could extinguish. She stood tall in the center of the chaos, her every rejection of silence amplifying the voices outside. Keller, however, seethed. Watching his world unravel by the minute gnawed at him. He had spent years wielding unchecked authority, sure that his badge and his allies would shield him. Now he sat surrounded by walls closing in, every escape blocked, every protector faltering. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, his chest heaving with rage he could barely contain. The desperation to bury the scandal reached its peak when officials inside the courthouse attempted one last maneuver. Late into the night, staff members were caught in the records office, frantically deleting files, shredding documents, and erasing digital logs. They thought their actions would go unnoticed, but nothing stayed hidden for long. Federal agents, already alerted to the scale of corruption, stormed the building with an emergency order. Screens froze mid-deletion. Shredders ground to a halt. Hard drives were seized on the spot. The scene was chaos. Lawyers shouted over one another. Clerks pleaded ignorance, and Keller's defenders scrambled like ants under fire. The federal order made clear what many had feared. The scandal was no longer just local. It was national now. Evidence tampering in a courthouse struck at the very core of trust in the justice system, and federal prosecutors were determined to lock it down before more could be lost. News of the attempted cover-up exploded online. Overnight, hashtags surged. "Justice cannot be deleted" trended beside Maya's name. Commentators on television thundered about institutional betrayal, about how corruption had rotted not just one officer but the entire framework that enabled him. What began as one man's brutality had become an indictment of a system desperate to hide its own crimes. Keller's composure finally shattered. In the middle of a tense hearing, with cameras rolling and his husband's hand gripping his arm, Keller erupted. He pointed at Vanessa, his face contorted with fury. "You think you can ruin me? You think you can destroy my life? I'll end this myself." He lunged forward, attempting to place her under arrest as if he still had authority, as if the badge stripped from his chest still held power. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters screamed, security officers surged forward, and for a moment the scene looked ready to spiral into violence again. But then the police chief himself stepped in. His voice cut through the mayhem, commanding and final. "That's enough, Keller. You're suspended, effective immediately." The badge Keller once wielded with arrogance was pulled from his chest, his authority stripped away in front of the nation. The silence that followed was deafening. For years, Keller had operated with impunity, shielded by allies and institutions. Now, in the span of seconds, it was gone. His body shook with rage and disbelief, but the weight of his downfall pressed heavy. Maya, standing just feet away, watched without a word. She didn't need to. The system had spoken louder than any retaliation she could deliver. Outside, the crowd roared as news spread. A corrupt officer had fallen. But Vanessa knew this was only one battle. The fight for truth was far from over, and the forces that had enabled Keller still lurked in the shadows. The storm was only beginning to clear, and what lay ahead promised an even fiercer reckoning. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed softly, but the tension inside was anything but quiet. Maya lay on the hospital bed, her breathing steady but her body marked with bruises and deep abrasions. Every movement brought a sharp sting, yet she kept her jaw set, refusing to let pain dictate her spirit. Doctors and nurses moved quickly around her, documenting every injury. Photographs were taken, charts filled with precise notes, each mark of violence recorded as evidence. The medical staff understood that what they were treating was not only a patient, but a soldier whose dignity had been trampled by injustice. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes and firm hands, gently lifted Maya's arm, revealing dark welts where Keller had forced her down. She shook her head, her voice low but resolute. "These aren't just bruises. This is assault. We'll make sure every detail is preserved." A nurse nodded, placing the images into a secured file, knowing full well these records would be called upon in court. The door swung open, and in rushed Layla, Maya's daughter. She was barely in her 20s, her eyes red from tears, her hands trembling as she rushed to her mother's side. "Mom!" she gasped, clutching Maya's hand as though it might vanish if she let go. "They told me! God, I thought—" Her words broke apart under the weight of relief and grief colliding all at once. Maya reached for her daughter's cheek, her fingers rough yet tender. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice steady despite the pain coursing through her body. "I'm alive. That's what matters." Layla leaned down, sobbing into her mother's shoulder, her body shaking. The sight of her daughter's tears broke through the soldier's hardened armor, reminding Maya of what she fought for, who she protected every day she wore the uniform. Vanessa entered moments later, her presence commanding yet gentle in the sterile space. She stood near the bed, arms crossed, but eyes filled with a quiet pride. "The world needs to see this," she said softly, nodding toward the doctors who continued documenting the injuries. "Every cut, every bruise. They tell a story Keller will never be able to erase." Maya gave a faint nod, squeezing her daughter's hand. The fight was not just about her anymore, it was about Layla. About every young person who deserved to walk through a courthouse without fear. About every black woman whose body bore scars from a system that treated them as targets. The ER became more than a place of healing. It was the beginning of a new battlefield, one where truth would be wielded as a weapon. Later that night, when the chaos had quieted and the machines beeped steadily beside her, Maya gave her testimony. Her body ached with each word, but her mind was sharp, her voice unwavering. Vanessa sat by her side, recording every detail, ensuring that nothing was lost. Maya described the moment Keller's hand struck her, the crushing force of his knee pinning her down, and the cruel laughter that echoed around the courtroom. But it was his words, venomous and dripping with prejudice, that struck hardest. "He called me a fraud," Maya said, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "He told me I didn't deserve my uniform, that my service meant nothing because of the color of my skin." Those words burned worse than the bruises. That was the moment I knew this was bigger than just an attack. It was an attempt to erase me, to erase everything I've stood for. Vanessa looked at her with quiet admiration. Even broken and bruised, Maya spoke with a calm authority that no courtroom could strip away. Her testimony was not just evidence, it was a declaration. A soldier wounded in battle, not on foreign soil, but at home, at the hands of those sworn to uphold the law. As the night stretched on, Maya and Vanessa reviewed the evidence together. The photos of her injuries were laid out like a grim gallery of truth. Each mark carried weight, each bruise a reminder of what had been done. Yet Maya refused to see herself as a victim. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "This isn't just about proving what he did to me. It's about showing people the reality of what power unchecked can do. I won't let him hide behind his badge, his lawyers, or his arrogance." Her daughter sat quietly, watching her mother with awe. Layla had grown up hearing stories of her mother's deployments, of battles fought in deserts and jungles far from home. But this was different. This was personal. For the first time, she realized her mother's greatest fight was not overseas, but right here, against the forces that tried to diminish her humanity. Word of Maya's testimony began to spread before dawn. Leaked by those inside the hospital, fragments of her quotes reached reporters and then the public. Her service meant nothing because of the color of her skin, the line repeated across television screens and social media posts, igniting outrage across the country. Maya's voice, raw and unfiltered, struck a chord that no lawyer could spin away. By morning, the nation was awake and watching. The 24-hour news cycle latched onto the story with unrelenting force. Footage of protesters outside the courthouse mixed with interviews from veterans who called Maya a hero, activists who demanded systemic change, and everyday citizens who could not believe a Navy SEAL had been brutalized in open court. Every major network carried her name, every headline seared with anger and disbelief. The Pentagon, usually cautious in weighing into civilian legal matters, faced mounting pressure. Reporters demanded answers at press briefings. How could a decorated service member be treated with such disregard? Did her years of sacrifice mean nothing to the country she swore to defend? Silence stretched thin, until finally, a spokesperson stepped forward. Their words were measured, but the message was unmistakable. "We are monitoring this case closely. The service and dignity of every man and woman who wears the uniform must be respected. We stand with those who uphold honor." It was not a full condemnation of Keller, but it was a statement strong enough to signal the tide was turning. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Maya faced a decision. Vanessa sat beside her with a folder, her expression grave but caring. "There's already talk of a settlement," she explained. "They'll come with numbers that look impossible to refuse. They'll try to buy your silence, to make this disappear. I have to ask, what do you want?" Maya looked at her daughter, then at the bruises on her arms. Her answer came without hesitation. "Justice is not negotiable." Her voice was calm but unyielding. "They can throw money at me, but money won't erase his words, won't undo the humiliation, won't change the fact that he thought he could get away with it because of who I am. No, Vanessa, this is bigger than me. This is about every woman, every Black service member, every person who has been told they don't belong. I will not take a settlement. I will take the truth however long it takes." Vanessa closed the folder slowly, her eyes shining with pride. "Then we fight," she said simply. And in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic, the course of history shifted. Outside, the crowd grew louder, fueled by Maya's refusal to bend. The story was no longer just about her pain, it had become about her choice. A choice to face the storm rather than hide from it. A choice that would echo far beyond the walls of the hospital, into every corner of the nation still wrestling with justice and truth. The morning after Maya's refusal to accept a settlement, the air around her home shifted. Reporters clustered on the sidewalks, but it was the sudden arrival of veterans that turned the street into something larger. They came in fatigues, biker jackets with unit patches, and old dress uniforms. Some walked with canes, others with prosthetic legs, but all stood tall. Together, they formed a protective barrier around Maya's house, linking arms in silent solidarity. These were men and women who had fought in wars across generations, from Vietnam to Iraq, and now they gathered here to defend one of their own. The sight was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. A Marine veteran, his hair silver but his posture unbroken, stood at the front line. "You'll have to go through us first," he told a reporter, pressing too close to the door. The message was clear. Maya would not stand alone. Inside the house, Layla peeked through the blinds, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom, they're everywhere. It looks like a wall of uniforms out there." Maya, resting on the couch with bandages still visible on her arms, gave a small smile. "That's what family looks like," she murmured. The support spread beyond the veterans. At the local university, students organized campaigns, holding vigils and marches demanding accountability for Keller's actions. Flyers appeared across campus reading, "Justice for Maya," with her photo alongside words highlighting her service. Social media lit up with hashtags, each one amplifying the demand for justice. The young and the old found common ground in her story. Students who had never set foot in a courtroom suddenly felt called to action, standing shoulder to shoulder with veterans who understood sacrifice. At night, the street outside Maya's home transformed into a place of unity. Veterans lit candles, students carried signs, and neighbors brought food. The chants that echoed were not angry, but resolute. They spoke of dignity, of honor, of a community refusing to be silenced. For Maya, watching from her window, it was overwhelming. She had fought wars overseas, but here at home she was witnessing a different kind of army rise. One built not on weapons, but on solidarity. Vanessa stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd with the caution of someone who knew how quickly tides could turn. "This is powerful," she admitted, "but it also paints a target on your back. The louder this gets, the more desperate Keller and his allies will become." Maya nodded. She knew it was true, but for the first time since the assault, she felt the weight lifting. She was no longer just one woman fighting against a system. She was part of something larger, something unstoppable. As the days passed, cracks within the police department began to widen. Whispers turned into confessions, and soon, whistleblowers began to step forward. Officers who had remained silent for years could no longer stomach what they had seen. One by one, they approached Vanessa, slipping her documents, copies of internal memos, and disciplinary records buried deep in the system. The weight of evidence grew heavier with each passing day. The breakthrough came when a young officer, nervous but determined, handed Vanessa a small thumb drive. His hand shook as he placed it in hers. "I can't keep quiet anymore," he confessed. "This has gone on too long. Keller isn't the only one. There are years of cover-ups, false reports, evidence tampered with. It's all here. Protect it, because if they know I gave it to you, I'm finished." His eyes darted around the dim cafe where they met, fear etched across his face. Vanessa placed a reassuring hand on his. "You did the right thing," she told him. "History will remember that." The files revealed a staggering pattern. Cases where Keller and others had suppressed evidence. Arrests that relied on fabricated reports. Complaints from civilians that were buried and never investigated. The thumb drive was not just evidence against Keller. It was a blueprint of systemic corruption stretching back years. When Maya saw the files, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "All those people," she whispered. "How many lives did they ruin?" Vanessa answered with a grim certainty. "Too many. But now we have proof. And once this comes to light, they won't be able to bury it again." News of the whistleblowers spread quickly, even before the files were fully reviewed. The public sensed a turning point. Keller was no longer just a rogue cop. He was the face of something rotten at its core. The alliance around Maya grew stronger, fed by the knowledge that her fight was pulling truth out of the shadows. That night, the veterans outside her home stood a little taller, knowing they weren't just defending Maya, they were guarding the spark of something bigger. Students printed flyers with the words "Truth is coming," while neighbors left candles burning on porches in silent protest. Maya sat with her daughter, her hand over Layla's. "This isn't just about me anymore," she said softly. "This is about tearing down every wall they built to keep us silent." The momentum reached a new height when General Hayes, a respected figure in the military community, broke his silence. Standing before a room of reporters, his voice was calm but filled with conviction. "What happened to Maya Carter is unacceptable," he declared. "An attack on her is an attack on every service member who has ever worn this nation's uniform. If we allow this kind of treatment to stand, we dishonor the very principles we swore to defend." His statement electrified the debate, framing Maya's ordeal not just as a local injustice, but as a matter of national security and respect for the military. Veterans groups across the country echoed his words, organizing rallies in cities far beyond Maya's home. The pressure mounted, and Keller's defenders grew fewer by the day. But as the support grew, so did the threats. Smear campaigns appeared online, painting Maya as unstable, questioning her service record, twisting her words into lies. Anonymous phone calls rang through the night, filled with venom and threats meant to break her resolve. One morning, Layla stepped outside to find slurs spray-painted across their fence, the red letters dripping like open wounds against the wood. For a moment, she felt the weight of despair pressing down. But then she grabbed a notebook and began to write. She documented everything, the calls, the vandalism, the lies. Page after page, she poured her heart onto paper, not as a victim, but as a witness. "If they want to silence us, they've already failed," she told her mother. "Every word I write is proof we're still standing." Maya pulled her daughter into an embrace, pride swelling in her chest. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered. Layla's journaling became more than a coping mechanism. It became a living record of resilience, a testimony that would one day speak louder than any smear campaign. As night fell, the veterans lit their candles again, their silhouettes forming a circle of protection. Inside, Maya sat with Vanessa and Layla, reviewing the files, planning the next step, and drawing strength from the alliance that had grown around her. The storm was far from over, but the army that now stood with her was unlike any she had ever known. The courtroom was already full an hour before the proceedings began. Every seat was taken, and still people crowded against the walls, waiting to see what would unfold. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks ready, cameras rolling. Veterans sat shoulder to shoulder with students, their presence a silent declaration that this was no ordinary trial. In the front row, Layla clutched her notebook to her chest, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the door where her mother would soon appear. When Maya entered, the room seemed to shift. She walked slowly, her wrists still scarred but uncovered, a quiet testimony etched into her skin. She wore no jewelry, no flashy attire, only a simple navy dress that allowed her strength to speak for itself. Heads turned, conversations hushed, and the murmurs of the gallery fell silent. She walked past rows of supporters, past strangers who nodded in respect, and finally sat down at the witness stand. Keller was already seated at the defense table. His face was stone, his jaw tight, his uniform gone, replaced by a suit that fit too neatly, as if he believed fabric alone could erase what he had done. He avoided Maya's eyes, staring instead at the polished wood of the table. Yet his stillness did not convey strength, it conveyed fear, masked by brittle pride. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and soon Maya was sworn in. Her voice carried across the silent room as she began to testify. She recounted the night of the assault with precision, her words calm, measured, but cutting. She described the moment Keller grabbed her, the words he spat with venom, and the weight of his blows. She spoke of the humiliation, the disbelief, the pain that followed, but she also spoke of something deeper. The years of service, the battles she had fought abroad, the sacrifices made in silence, only to come home and be treated as if her life and dignity were worth nothing. At one point, Vanessa placed her hand on the table, a steady presence reminding Maya that she was not alone. Layla's tears fell silently, but she never looked away. Every sentence Maya spoke stripped away another layer of Keller's defense. He shifted in his seat, his composure cracking as the truth bore down on him. When the prosecutor asked if she remembered Keller's exact words during the assault, Maya's voice did not falter. She repeated them, each syllable echoing in the room, searing themselves into the silence. Gasps rose from the gallery. Some bowed their heads, others clenched fists, anger mixing with grief. Keller finally looked at her then, his mask breaking for a split second, shame flickering across his face, before hardening into denial once more. Maya sat back, her testimony complete, her presence unshaken. She had faced battlefields before, but this was her final battlefield. And she had stood with dignity, giving voice to more than just her own suffering. The trial stretched for days, but the weight of testimony was undeniable. Witnesses stepped forward, whistleblowers provided their accounts, and the files from the thumb drive painted a picture of corruption that could no longer be denied. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of Keller's defense. His lawyers argued, objected, tried to spin narratives, but every word Maya had spoken seemed to echo louder, drowning out their attempts. When the time for the verdict arrived, the room held its breath. The jury filed in, their expressions grave. The foreman rose, the paper trembling in his hand, and delivered the words that seemed to ripple across the entire city. Keller was convicted on all counts: assault, violation of civil rights, and abuse of authority. He was permanently banned from ever working in law enforcement again. A lifetime defined by a badge had ended in disgrace. The courtroom erupted, not with cheers, but with the quiet sound of relief. Veterans bowed their heads, students wept openly. Layla buried her face in her hands, her tears soaking through her notebook. Maya reached over, wrapping her daughter in an embrace, her own eyes wet but her voice steady. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But the reckoning did not stop with Keller. The files had implicated others, supervisors who had buried complaints, officials who had signed off on false reports, leaders who had chosen silence over accountability. One by one, they were removed from office, escorted out of their roles by marshals. The courthouse that had once shielded corruption now became the site of its undoing. For Vanessa, it was a moment of vindication. She had fought battles like this before, but rarely had she seen the system bend so fully toward justice. She stood beside Maya, her hand briefly brushing her client's shoulder. "You didn't just win this case," she said softly. "You cracked something open that can't be closed again." The city felt the shift. Headlines ran bold, declaring Keller's conviction a landmark in accountability. Families who had once stayed quiet began speaking, finding courage in Maya's example. What had started as one woman's story had become a mirror reflecting the rot in an entire institution. And for the first time in years, people believed change was possible. The transformation came swiftly. The courthouse's security wing, once a place that symbolized intimidation, was repurposed into a civil rights training center. Where guards had once barked orders and turned a blind eye to abuse, classrooms now taught the principles of equity, dignity, and justice. Walls once covered in sterile paint were lined with photographs of civil rights leaders, veterans, and survivors of injustice. And at the heart of it all, Maya was asked to lead the reform initiative. At first, she hesitated. She had already given so much, her body, her spirit, her truth. But when she stood in the newly renovated halls, hearing the voices of young recruits learning lessons born from her pain, she realized this was not just about survival. It was about building a future where no one would endure what she had. She accepted, not as a figurehead, but as a teacher, a mentor, and a living reminder of what resilience could accomplish. 1 year later, Maya stood at a podium during a ceremony marking the anniversary of the reforms. The crowd stretched far, filled with veterans, students, neighbors, and strangers who had followed her journey. Cameras broadcast the moment nationwide, but Maya's focus was on the faces in front of her, the ones who had carried her when she could not stand alone. She raised her hands, the scars on her wrists visible under the lights. They were not marks of defeat, they were symbols of endurance. Her voice carried steady and strong as she spoke. "This isn't vengeance," she said. "It's survival. It's change. What happened to me should never happen to anyone else. And because we stood together, it never will again." The crowd rose in unison, the applause rolling like thunder across the plaza. Veterans saluted, students cheered, and Layla stood with tears in her eyes, her notebook clutched to her chest. Vanessa, watching from the side, allowed herself a rare smile, knowing the fight had not been in vain. In that moment, Maya's legacy was sealed. Her scarred wrists were no longer a reminder of cruelty, but a national symbol of resilience and reform. Her story had begun with violence and humiliation, but it ended here, with hope, with transformation, and with the quiet power of a woman who refused to be broken.